You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Hey everyone, before we get started, I wanted to give a quick content warning for this episode. We're going to be talking about the horror genre and how that intersects with the Bible and biblical morality. But just by nature of the topic that we are going to be addressing, there's going to be a good bit of content that some listeners may find disturbing. I'm going to do my best not to be overly gratuitous, so I'm just going to be talking about these topics as they appear in the Bible. But how the Bible presents horror is a lot more graphic than what a lot of people have been taught in church. So I just want to warn you right up front, especially if you're someone who might be highly sensitive or tends to listen to these with kids, this is not going to be your typical church Sunday school lesson. The Bible covers topics of gore, violence, sexuality, and abuse, and all different sorts of things that just don't make it into a typical church sermon. But I think that there is value in drawing attention to these so that we can get a full picture of Scripture. So again, I'm not going to be too over the top with it, but if you have never heard this perspective before, it's going to be a little jarring when you realize how much of the horror genre is in the Bible. So just wanted to put that up front there and give you a heads up for what we have ahead. All right, on to the episode. Evening, or morning, or afternoon, or whatever time of day it is that you are listening to this. And welcome to a special episode of the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered that we are calling Sacred Nightmares, the Bible's Horror Stories. We usually try not to date our episodes by any specific current events talk of what time of year it is or anything, but right now, as we are recording, it is October of 2023, and that means that there is a very special day coming up at the end of the month. That's right, it is Harvest Festival for all of you independent Baptists, Southern Baptists, Christian churches, and community churches out there. For everybody else, it is Halloween. Now, I'm only half joking there. I grew up in an independent Baptist church, so if you're anything like me, you know that we really did not celebrate Halloween. There was no such thing on the calendar. It was completely taboo. Churches always replaced it with a fall festival or harvest festival, trunk and treat, something along those lines. You know, the names for it changed every 5 to 10 years just to keep it sounding cute and trendy, even though it was already like 10 years out of date. But yeah, that's how churches go. And of course, we were very adamant that we do not celebrate Halloween. We do not dress up. We do not hand out candy. We do not accept candy. If you do hand out candy, it better have a tract in it for all of the kids there. But once Fall Festival rolls around, you know, we let all of the other kids dress up for the festival. See, I almost said it there. But yeah, we let the kids dress up for the Fall Festival, and we give them lots of candy. But it's definitely not Halloween. You know, those are two totally separate things. Gotta love it. Halloween, I understand, is a very touchy topic for a lot of Christians, and with good reason. I want to be fair to that. Halloween is probably the most, and this is appropriate, I suppose, but Halloween is like the most mutated holiday out of any day on the calendar, because it has just changed so much over the course of history. Most people will tell you that Halloween has its roots in a Celtic pagan holiday called Samhain, and then over time it became Christianized, especially with the Roman Catholic Church stepping in and making November 1st All Saints' Day. That made the day before it the eve before All Saints' Day, or All Hallowed Eve, which eventually became Halloween over time. More recently in history, some Christians have taken issue with that because Christianizing something pagan doesn't make it okay to them, and so they just see a lot of demonic stuff at the heart and core of Halloween, and they just see it as basically irredeemable. The funny thing with that is if you take that position with Halloween, you pretty much have to remove any religious holiday from your calendar, at least the main ones if you're not in a liturgical tradition, because Easter and Christmas are the same. They were pagan holidays long before they were Christian holidays. The history of the church has been a syncretistic one. Throughout history, as Christianity spread from the Middle East, it assimilated the cultures of the people that it spread to. So a holiday like Christmas that was related to Saturnalia and winter solstice and all these different pagan rituals, as Christians saw that, they kind of took a page from the Apostle Paul when he was on Mars Hill, or the Areopagus in Acts, I want to say it's somewhere around chapter 16, something like that. And he looked at all of the gods there and said, okay, you have this one altar to an unknown god, so I'm going to say that I'm presenting to you this unknown god. Like, he looked at the culture there and found an easy foothold in. Well, that's kind of been the history of Christianity, is they saw these pagan rituals and said, okay, we don't necessarily agree with that, but we can take your culture and add Christianity into it. That has been the history of Christianity for the last 2,000 years. But more recently, some people have not been okay with that, and they have tried to separate Christian holidays from their pagan roots, which is not necessarily the topic today, but I just like to make the point, if you have an issue with Halloween because of pagan roots, you also have to remove Christmas and Easter. And that's not something a lot of people want to do. I have actually known some who do, and they refuse to call Christmas Christmas. It's basically, the birth of Jesus, and then Easter isn't Easter, it's Resurrection Sunday. And hey, if you're going to do that, I applaud you for being consistent, but ultimately I don't think that's the best view to take. Because you can either look at this as Christianity succumbing to culture throughout time, and if you do, you're going to have a very negative outlook, or you could view it as, my Christianity, my faith, overcame those pagan elements. So where some people look at this and they say, oh, there's just pagan roots at all this, and we have to be completely different from that, I look at it and go, there were pagan elements there, but my faith, my Christianity, was so appealing to these people that they actually took that on instead. And so there have always been aspects of culture that are assimilated into Christianity. If that was not the case, we would all be worshipping every Saturday like Jewish people. From the very beginning, we changed elements of the culture, right? We started worshipping on Sunday. Yes, Jesus rose on Sunday. But that was also a day in the Roman calendar related to the sun god. And so there have always been these things where if you look at a church in America today, it looks nothing like a church service in China today, or in England possibly, or France, or Mexico, or what have you, unless maybe that church was started by an American missionary. If it's its own cultural thing, it's going to be unique, because every culture is different. And when Christianity came to those different cultures, it accepted elements of their culture, not all of it. There were certain things that were rejected, and I think that's important. But there were also elements where wise people throughout history have said, this is not in conflict. God created these people, and their culture is not evil just because it is different from ours. So I'm able to look at a holiday like Halloween and say, this is not inherently evil. This is actually my Christian faith stepping in and overcoming the pagan roots of this and changing its meaning. And along with that, something can change its meaning with time. Just because a holiday meant something 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, or even a few hundred years ago, doesn't mean that it has to have the exact same meaning today. So all things worth keeping in mind there. Now, with our episode today, I want to address the concept of horror and the Bible. Horror as a genre is often associated with Halloween. Once October rolls around, you start seeing the specials run on TV of Friday the 13th and Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street and all the old franchises and everything like that. And so a lot of Christians have pitted themselves against the horror genre. They will see it as something that is just inherently evil. It is bad because of its correlation with Halloween and whatever might be depicted in the movie. But in the time that we have today, I actually want to challenge that idea, and I want to suggest to you that horror as a genre of literature, and I don't want to say entertainment, but I'm including movies in there as well. Horror as a genre is no better or worse than any other genre. Also, I want to make the case that it is an extremely biblical genre, and I would say actually the most conservative Christian genre a writer could utilize. Now, in order to do that, I have to address certain arguments against horror, and then I want to give some arguments for it from a biblical perspective, And then I want to spend the rest of the time going through examples of horror in the Bible. The kinds of things that definitely didn't end up in a Precious Moments Bible, but they are very much there. And if we look at this book as an authority for our lives, we can't just pick out the stuff that makes for good children's Bible stories. We also have to acknowledge the parts of the Bible that are uncomfortable and that make us squirm in our seats, because if you view this as inspired authority for your life, you cannot pick and choose what you like about it. You have to let the uncomfortable parts sit with you as well. So that's going to be the task here today. I'm going to be drawing very heavily on the work of Brian Godawa. If you do not know Brian Godawa's work, I will link to it in the show notes. He is a very, very prolific author. That guy has written so much. He has several novel series, and his novels are very unique. They tend to be biblical fiction, so he's drawing on the stories of main characters in the Bible. He has a novel on Noah, I think Enoch, Moses I know he has, and several others. But they are written from the perspective of the supernatural worldview that we've talked about in some of our episodes here, well, many of our episodes. And his perspective in these is that these gods, these supernatural beings, actually existed and interacted with the people in the stories. So it is fictionalized, but it's written in a way that gets you thinking about the Bible from an angle that no one else's writing has, that at least not that I'm aware of. His stuff is super unique. It's usually pretty cheap on Amazon, so you can read plenty that he has up there. He has also written nonfiction. He literally wrote the textbook on Hollywood worldviews in movies. Like, literally, it is a textbook that he wrote about the worldview of Hollywood movies, and it is fascinating. If you enjoy movies, you should absolutely check out that book. It is fantastic. He's written lots of other nonfiction as well. We will link to a lot of that in the show notes, and I'm going to be drawing on his work because he has an article that he wrote years ago about an apologetic for horror. And he is viewing the horror genre from a conservative Christian lens as someone who believes that the Bible dictates what he can and cannot do in his life and sets the standard for that. And he makes a very fascinating and unique case that horror is a biblical genre and actually have a very powerful Christian message to it. So a lot of the examples that I'm going to be drawing from and points I'm going to be making are right out of his work, and particularly that Apologetic of Horror article and some of the other works that he has written. So let's jump into looking at some arguments people can make against the horror genre. The first one is that they'll say it's all demonic, and we just need to avoid that. This is going to be sort of like a 1 Corinthians 10:21 argument, where Paul is saying you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils, you cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and the table of devils. The problem with that is that not all horror has anything to do with demons. Yes, there are some classic horror examples, even something like The Exorcist or Conjuring movies or anything like that, that deals with the demonic, but not all horror does. In fact, there's a good deal of horror that has nothing demonic in it at all. So even if you're just going off of that, you can't write off an entire genre just because of a certain element in certain aspects of it. And portraying demons is not in and of itself demonic. There are demons in the Bible, and even Jesus interacted with demons. So you have these people who are unwilling to even see a portrayal of it because they're saying, oh, I don't want to get close to it at all. Well, Jesus got up close and personal with it, and I realize we're not Jesus, but then he also had his disciples going out and interacting with demons. Now, I do not come from a charismatic background, so I am not the type of person who thinks that we should be going out trying to interact with demons intentionally. And I realize that's kind of a stereotype, not all charismatics do. But I'm not the type of Christian who believes that you should be purposefully trying to interact with the supernatural realm, particularly the bad side of it. But I do think that we can sometimes have interactions with the supernatural realm that we did not intend. I think that people can truly have experiences with the demonic today, unintentionally so. And that is not something that we have to be terrified of if we are coming from a biblical Christian perspective. And I'll talk about this more in a little bit here, but the Bible makes very clear that God has power over all of that. And if you're on his side, you do not have to fear something that he has power over. So I reject the argument that all horror is demonic. That's just simply not true. All horror does not portray demonic things. All horror does not stem from the demonic, and even if it did, we do not have to fear a portrayal of that, at least not from a Christian standpoint. In fact, that verse that a lot of people will use in 1 Corinthians 10:21 about combining the way of God and the way of devils has to be read within its ancient context, where Paul was writing to these Corinthian believers who used to be pagans. He wasn't writing to Christians who wanted to watch a Halloween movie. He was writing to people who actually used to be in the service of devils, of demons. And he's saying, as you have now come into Christianity, as you are now partaking in Christian sacraments like communion, do not think that this worship of Yahweh is the same thing as worshiping those other supernatural beings. You have changed sides. You are now serving a different God, a different master. So you can't be divided halfway. You can't be going to the local Christian gathering on Sunday and then also going to the pagan temple of whatever god or goddess on Monday. Choose a side and don't be divided. So he's not talking about what entertainment you pick. He's talking about people who are actually having to choose between two entirely different religions. A second argument that I've heard is that we should be avoiding the world and just anything that is worldly. This is going to be based in something like Romans 12:2. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. The problem with that is world then gets defined however you want to define it. We tend to treat it as something secular, a secular movie, secular music, secular book, secular entertainment, whatever it may be. Those are of the world, and so that we're not supposed to be like that. We're not supposed to be enjoying that. We're not supposed to be anywhere near that sort of thing. But that's not what verses like this are talking about at all. See, there were two different words in New Testament Greek for world. You had cosmos, which had the idea of world order. That's where you get things like John saying, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. He doesn't mean that you can't enjoy a good cheesesteak or a good movie or, whatever it may be. He's saying, don't get attached to this world order, the way that people strive and fight to get one up over each other. The way of the world is not something that isn't Christian. It means a mindset that is selfish, and basically the mindset of the serpent in the garden that is encouraging you to put yourself over other people. That is the way of the world. That is the sort of thing that the Bible is saying to avoid. Avoid the selfish messages that will get pushed on you. And that can be both within and without the church. Now, in verses like this, here in Romans 12, it's a different word for word, and it's the word aionios. That is a word that means age, a time that you are in. So Paul is not saying, don't enjoy the culture of your day. He's saying, don't be enamored with, don't get stuck in your time period. You are going to be living for eternity. You are going to be in an era beyond your own. Consider the wisdom outside of your time. If you're Gen Z, don't get stuck on just what Gen Z says. Listen to what generations before you have said. If you're a boomer, don't think that way back when in your time it was better. You can learn from the generations that are after you today. So don't get stuck to the time, to the generation that you're in. Consider the perspectives of other people. Don't get too attached to one era of time. This is not your permanent home. Paul's argument is that it would be like if you were going to flip a house, but then you moved all of your stuff into that house and got comfortable there. That's not what you're supposed to do. You're not going to stay there. You're going to be selling it to someone else. That's not a wise decision to make. So he's not saying don't enjoy the culture. He's saying don't live like this is the only life that you have. And where a lot of Christians try to avoid the world, they end up just avoiding natural life, things that aren't sinful, but just because they're secular or not Christian, these Christians think that they have to avoid them. And that's not the message of the Bible at all. I mean, just look at Jesus. Just look at the life he lived. Look at the people he hung out with. Look at the parties he went to. Just because something is not inherently Christian or for a religious purpose does not mean it is sinful. I grew up with the mindset of that with music. Like, if it is not Christian, you shouldn't be listening to it. Where that finally broke down for me, and it took years for me to realize this, but if you take that mindset, you better never sing The Wheels on the Bus to your kid. Because that ain't Christian, and it doesn't have any greater Christian message. Secular does not equal worldly or sinful. There is no sacred secular divide in Scripture. Whether or not something is glorifying to God is about how you use it, not about the thing itself. Third argument that I have heard is, it's kind of similar to the second one, but it's people who have this hear no evil, see no evil approach. They're going to say, I don't want any kind of badness in my entertainment. I don't want blood, gore, cursing, violence, sexuality. I don't want anything like that. And there are several different Bible verses that they could look to for this sort of thing. And I'll go through a few here and address each one as we do. A good example would be Isaiah 33:15-17. They'll say, the person who walks righteously and speaks uprightly, he despises the gain of false oppressions. He shakes his hand from holding bribes. In other words, he's an honest person. He stops his ears from the hearing of blood and shuts his eyes from the seeing of evil. He will dwell on high. His place of defense will be the munitions of the rocks. And it goes on to praise this person. So they'll look at that and say, I don't want to see blood. I don't want to watch anything that has evil in it. The problem with that is, though, if you are taking that position, you'll hear me say this a few times, if you're taking the position that I don't want to see any depictions of sex, violence, blood, gore, anything like that, you better stop reading the Bible. Because the Bible is full of depictions of evil. You can depict evil without supporting evil. In fact, I would argue, and I will in a little bit here, that you have to depict evil accurately in order to fight against it. And it's kind of like a kid's movie, where the villains, no matter how evil they may be, you don't really see them killing people, because it's a kid's movie. So that works if you're a kid, but when you're an adult and you start to watch these again, a lot of times it just loses its bite. You're there and you're going, this guy doesn't feel that bad, because he hasn't actually convinced me he's capable of any true evil. It's just all threats. So if you have a kind of movie, and a lot of Christian movies like this, a lot of Hallmark movies are like this, where they're just very tame, PG style rating, there's no true evil in it, you really struggle to have a believable villain in your story. And that's not at all the case with the Bible. And in verses like this, you have to understand as well that this is talking about your actions, not your entertainment. Now I realize entertainment can affect us, but when the prophet was speaking to Israel here, he wasn't talking to them about the kinds of plays that they were out watching, or the kinds of scrolls that they were reading. He was talking about the actions that they were taking part in. Stopping your ears from hearing blood or shutting your eyes from seeing evil is not talking about the TV in front of you. Isaiah would have had no clue what a TV was. He's talking about if somebody comes to you and says, I want vengeance against this person, I'm going to go out and hurt them. You shouldn't be a part of that fight. Or if you see somebody who's very clearly going to do something wrong, harmful to another person, you should not have any part of what they're doing. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about the actions that you choose, not the entertainment that you're taking in. And even though entertainment can have an effect on you, I would argue that it's not nearly as powerful as a lot of conservative Christians want to say. Think about this with me. You have people who are going to say, I don't want to see any blood, gore, violence, anything like that depicted in a movie because I don't want to be desensitized to it. Okay, do you want to go out and rob a bank every time there's a heist in a movie that you watch? Do you want to cheat on your spouse if there's an affair? Are you that easily swayed by what you see? Do you decide to buy a new car just because you see a commercial for a new car while you're watching a sports game? Do you feel even remotely tempted to buy a new car because of how awesome they're making it sound in the commercial? I would wager no. And if you're anything like me, the more you see a commercial, the more you're actually turned off by it because you're saying, you're throwing it in my face. I want nothing to do with this. If you are so easily swayed by what you see that all it takes is having this in front of you that you're now concerned about that, I'm not trying to be silly here, but in all seriousness, as a therapist, I would actually suggest talking to a therapist because healthy adults know the difference between fantasy and reality, and they're able to separate those two. And that is something that I think we have to keep in mind, that we're putting too much power in the hands of entertainment when as Christians we actually have power through God over our own minds and bodies. The Bible says we are no longer slaves to sin. That means that if you see sin happening, you do not have to follow it. You can choose to make better decisions. Another argument similar to this is going to be out of Philippians 4:8. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, honest, just, pure, lovely, good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. And so you'll get some Christians who say, well, something like horror, that is just full of filthy, awful, sinful things, which, again, isn't true. It's a stereotype. Are there some movies that are quite graphic and filled with more than others? Absolutely. But don't judge an entire genre based on a few examples. And furthermore, Paul is not saying here that you can't ever think negative thoughts. He's giving last-minute life advice to the Philippian church about how to live a good life. He's not saying you can't ever have a negative thought. He is saying that this should be the overarching story of your life, that you're meditating on things that are true and righteous and pure and lovely, beautiful, honest. And think about that. If you are someone who has ever tried a meditation of any sort, what are you thinking of? Positive things like this. Like, Paul is basically giving you the same advice that a therapist would if the therapist says, get a meditation app and spend a few minutes each day thinking something positive. Like, that's what Paul is saying here. He is saying focus on the positive things if you want a more positive outlook. He's not saying you can't ever have negative things. There are certain roles in life that are just going to have negative things in them. My dad was a police officer for several years, so I think of it with that. If you're a cop, you have to think about things that aren't true, honest, just, pure, holy, lovely. You have to be thinking about things that aren't true. Could this person possibly be lying to me? You have to think about things that aren't pure if you see a crime scene, right? You can't just have constantly good thoughts in your mind at all times. So keep that in mind, that we have to realize the Bible's message is telling us an ideal of what we should be living toward, not the reality of how life often is. And so our actions get caught between the ideal that the Bible is presenting and the reality of the world that we live in. And there's a lot of gray in those in between. I think Gadawa makes a really good point here talking about this verse when he says, it is also true, honorable, and right to show the suicidal, rotting flesh of Judas, the betrayer of the gospel. It is not only pure, lovely, and of good repute that Noah was depicted in the Bible as a righteous man, but it is also pure, lovely, and of good repute that all the other inhabitants of the earth around him were depicted as entirely wicked and worthy of destruction. It is not only excellent and worthy of praise that Lot was revealed as a righteous man, it is also excellent and worthy of praise that the destroyed inhabitants of Sodom were revealed as unrighteous men. End of quote. So we have to realize that it falls well within the bounds of biblical virtue to depict evil for what it is. I'll throw in one more here before we go on to the next point. I heard some people say 1 Thessalonians 5:22 in this context. Abstain from all appearance of evil. This one was used a lot when I was younger. Anything that anyone thought could potentially be bad, well, stay away from that because it could appear evil to someone else. The problem is that is an argument off of English that doesn't hold up in Greek. The word appearance there is actually type. Paul was not saying abstain from anything that could look like evil. He said abstain from all types of evil, all forms of evil. If you're going off of what could look evil to someone, you are never going to do anything in your life because there's always someone who could be offended at what you do. Your job is not to base your life on whether or not someone else will get upset about what you do. It is to make the best decisions for your own life, your own family, before God. If you're constantly spending time worrying about whether someone else is going to see this as okay or not, you are living in the fear of man instead of the fear of God, as the Bible would say, and that is not a positive thing. So yes, abstain from all forms of evil, but don't worry about whether or not someone else is going to be too concerned about what you do. Worry about yourself and let them worry about God. Or as Paul also says, every servant gives account to his own master, not to you, if I can paraphrase there. Oh yeah, I definitely have to add this one in, because this one gets thrown around a lot too. Ephesians 5:12. For it is a shame to even speak of those things which are done in secret. And so some Christians will look at that and be like, oh, we can't even talk about this. This is awful stuff. Don't do anything. Don't go near anything that portrays evil. But if you have been listening to this podcast at all, hopefully you remember that context is key. You always have to consider the context. Anyone can pull a verse like this out of context and say, see, the Bible is trying to say X, when really it's nowhere near that. You can look at Ephesians 5:12 on its own, and it's a shame even to speak of those things that are done in secret. Well, we shouldn't even go anywhere near any sort of depiction of this. People talk about, we shouldn't even talk about it. But you cannot ignore the verses literally right before and right after this one. Let's look at Ephesians 5:11-13. and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them, for it is a shame even to speak of those things which are done of them in secret. But all things that are reproved are made manifest by light. For whatever is made manifest is light. So the message of this entire passage here, just these few verses, is Paul saying, you have to expose evil. You have to be willing to talk about it in order to show it for what it is. Saying it is a shame even to speak of the things that are done of them in secret is saying that the horrible things that these evil people were doing were just so bad it would make you cringe to even have to talk about it. But what he is not saying is we shouldn't ever talk about evil things, because that goes against the verses right before and after. We actually have to talk about those evil things. We actually have to display them and draw attention to them in order to win over them. If you just take a simplistic mindset of don't look at anything bad, don't watch anything bad, don't listen to anything bad, then please stop reading the Bible, because in a few minutes here I'm about to show you just how much of that sort of content is in the Bible. These verses, while they can apply to your life, they are not directly talking about the entertainment that you see or listen to. They are talking about the actions that you yourself take. I know some people would say, but the Bible portrays historical violence accurately, but it's not as gratuitous as, say, watching a movie or playing a video game. And I get what they're saying. There is a little bit of a difference between reading something on a page and watching a movie. But there is also fictional violence in the Bible, too. The Bible's depictions of blood, sex, gore, violence, they're not all just historical depictions. Some of them are fictional stories that use those elements, particularly in the prophets and apocalyptic writing, and we'll definitely have plenty of examples from that. So let me counter all of this with some Bible verses that would actually suggest the opposite. That horror can have a place in a Christian's worldview and actually can be supportive of a Christian worldview. First, I want to say, if you believe in God, you do not have to fear natural or supernatural evil. Psalm 27:1 says, "The Lord Yahweh is my light and salvation. Who should I fear? Yahweh is my strength and my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" Psalm 139:12 says, "Yea, the darkness hides not from you, but the night shines as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to you." So if you follow God, you do not have to be afraid of these things. I know some people who just seem terrified of even the cover on the disc of a horror movie. I understand different people have different personalities, some are more sensitive than others, and that's totally fine. But if this is coming from a religious mindset of, I'm just terrified to get anywhere near that, that's not biblical. In fact, I would say that is ungodly fear, the kind of thing that the love of God casts out. Second point, you need to be reminded who the real enemy is. And horror does that. Ephesians 6:12 says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." A lot of times we get so caught up in what other people are doing that we end up treating another human being as the enemy. They have a different worldview than we do, so they are the enemy. They are the one against us. And Paul says, no. The enemy is this supernatural evil that wants to destroy humanity. What the author of Genesis depicted as an animal crouching outside the door of Cain's tent in chapter 4. Horror can help to remind us of that, because a lot of horror, not all, but a lot does have supernatural elements where there is something beyond the natural realm that is malevolent. And that can be a reminder to us that the war we fight as Christians is not against other people, but against ways of life that are self-destructive. It can also remind us of the war within ourselves. I'm reminded of the Apostle Paul's basically Jekyll and Hyde-like passage where he says that the things I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, those are the things I do. And there's this war inside every single human being that is dragging us either closer to a way of life or down to a way of death. And that is something that is depicted in a lot of horror movies as well. Another Christian value that shows up in many horror movies is self-sacrifice. Gadawa points out how this is often in pandemic movies or zombie movies or monster movies of some sort, where the hero has to decide to put other people in front of himself. He is going to save somebody else and potentially put himself at risk. That is a Christian virtue, And it is often displayed in these horror movies. In fact, the people who tend to die first are usually the ones who are the most selfish, who are putting themselves ahead of other people, and the movie is telling us through their death that is not the best way to live. In fact, I will make a claim, and I will stand by this, that horror is the most conservative Christian genre of any form of entertainment. I know that may be surprising to you, but think about this with me. A lot of people just look at the violence or the sexuality or the language that might be used in a horror movie and say, well, that can't possibly be Christian. That's sinful. Well, we've already talked about how a depiction of sin does not itself equal sin. Otherwise, you would have to say the Bible is sinful. But let's consider the morality behind the story. You can't just look at what happens in a story and say that's the message. You have to look at which characters do what. If the villain is doing something in a story, that's probably suggesting that's not the best way to live. If the hero's doing it, the person making the movie or writing the book or what have you is probably trying to say, this is my worldview. This is the way I would suggest living. So if you look at a horror movie, let's just take, for example, the old 1970s, 1980s slasher, once you get into Halloween, Friday the 13th, those sorts of things. Who are the first people to die in those movies? The kids who are out having sex, drinking, smoking, using foul language, they are the first ones to die. Who is the person to survive the movie? The virgin girl that didn't get involved in all of the other stuff that the rest of the kids were doing. So there is actually a very conservative Christian message embedded in a lot of horror of don't get rushed into being involved with all of the stuff that kids do. Take the time to grow up and don't feel like you have to be involved in stuff that you might not be okay with or ready for. That is very conservative Christian. Consider how many conservative Christians think that the world is an increasingly evil place with fewer and fewer good people. Well, that sounds like your typical horror movie, where there is just evil all around and only a few good people who are then challenged to make good decisions over selfish decisions in the movie. That's very Christian. And going along with what we're talking about here, I would say that God actually commands us to draw attention to evil. We talked about that in the Ephesians verse. I'd also bring in John 3:20. Everyone who does evil hates the light and doesn't come to the light unless his deeds were to be reproved. So in other words, someone who is doing wrong is the type of person who is going to say, let's not draw attention to this. It's actually someone who is trying to expose evil for what it is that's going to put a spotlight on it. So that was my third argument. Fourth argument, I know this one's going to be controversial for some people, but hey, this whole episode has been, and really the whole podcast is, I suppose. But fourth, you need to know the culture you're in order to affect it. I want to give you 3 separate quotes, and they're going to seem to have nothing to do with each other, but they are actually connected. Acts 17:28, Paul says, "For in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also other of your poets have said, for we also are his offspring." 1 Corinthians 15:33, "Be not deceived, evil communication corrupts good manners." And Titus 1:12, "One of themselves, even a prophet of their own, said, the Cretians are always liars, evil beasts and slow bellies." What in the world do those 3 verses have in common? Well, they are all times that the Apostle Paul quoted from Greek playwrights, Aratus, Menander, and Epimenides. In fact, the entire Bible is full of allusions to books and plays and even poetry and songs outside of the Bible. We've talked about this a lot in our Genesis 1-6 series, where we draw attention to other ancient Near Eastern literature that's referenced or challenged in those chapters. Well, it's all throughout the Bible, where even in the New Testament, the authors allude to or reference works that were not religious. And that can be upsetting to some people, but I don't think it should be. We have to realize that there is no sacred secular divide in Scripture. Something is not bad just because it wasn't made for a religious purpose. It's about what you do with it. So Paul was well versed in the pop culture of his day, and he referenced it. Now, that doesn't mean that he always agreed with it, but he found key points that were worth knowing so that he could touch off on it with other people. I've known plenty of Christians where they couldn't tell you the name of a single superhero, they've never seen a Star Wars movie, they've never seen anything that has been popular in the past 50 years, basically. If it was made after the 1960s, they want nothing to do with it. And again, personal preferences, do what you want. But if you're doing that for a religious reason, I think that is extremely misguided, because the message of the Bible is actually to be immersed in the culture that you are in so that you can make an impact in it. You cannot impact something that you keep yourself at a distance from. Alright, number 5. Horror can be a reminder that there is justice beyond this life. I think of ghost stories, where you have ghosts that at first seem to be haunting a person, but then as the story goes on, you realize that they actually just have unfinished business in this life, and they're trying to get the living human to help them finish whatever it is that they left incomplete. Some Christians, particularly those not of a Catholic background, are going to be offended by that, because it kind of sounds like a purgatory idea, or that there's kind of an in-between between heaven and hell that someone can be stuck in. But I think that those stories are using that narrative to suggest that there is still justice beyond the grave. That even after a person has died, or extreme amounts of time have passed, we are responsible to tell the full story, and to see justice done in this life for the people who still remain. That's even reminiscent of Genesis 4, when Cain kills Abel, and God says that Abel's blood cries out to him from the ground. It kind of has that same feel to me, so I think that can very much be a biblical message as well. And lastly, this is a point that Gadawa makes all the time. Redemption is only as powerful as what you are being redeemed from. If your story does not portray evil, or it portrays a very weak and wimpy evil, the payoff of that story is going to be weak and wimpy as well. The victory of the hero can only be as great as the evil that he has to overcome. And so if you are not portraying evil accurately, if you are neutering it for the purpose of your audience, you are going to be preventing your story from having the impact that it could. And I believe that's part of why the Bible message is so powerful. Because the Bible as a whole is actually full of all kinds of horrific elements, stuff pulled right out of Twilight Zone, or Godzilla movies, or zombie apocalypse sort of things. All of that is in the Bible. So let's actually talk about some of this right now. Let's go through the sacred nightmares of the Bible, the stuff that you are definitely not hearing in Sunday school or a church sermon. Let's start off with some monsters. Good monsters movie. How about vampires? Did you know there are vampires in the Bible? Seriously, there are a lot of depictions of evil people drinking the blood of their victims. Ezekiel 39:18-19. You will eat the flesh of the mighty, and drink the blood of the princes of the earth, of rams, of lambs, of goats, of bullock, all of them fatlings of Bashan. And you will eat fat till you be full, and drink blood till you be drunken, of my sacrifice which I have sacrificed for you. That's not exactly in a Precious Moments Bible. How about like Frankenstein? We've got half-human monster recreations of something, also in Ezekiel. A lot of our stuff is going to be coming from the prophets today. They had some very active imaginations. Ezekiel 11:19, it's actually a pretty popular verse. It says, I will give to them one heart, and I will put a new spirit within you. I will take out the stony heart from their flesh, and give them a heart of flesh. Some of you might be hearing that and going, whoa, Colin, come on. That's actually a positive verse. That's a good thing that God is doing. And I would say, yes, 100% it is. But we live in an era of heart transplants. It is within the realm of possibility for us to imagine someone having their heart replaced. The Bible wasn't written in our culture. Imagine with me, a couple thousand years ago, if you were to tell someone, I am going to take out your stubborn heart, and I'm going to replace it with another. Now, I realize we use heart metaphorically, but Ezekiel used very tactile physical imagery, so I think he was actually trying to get us to imagine this in a literal sense. And in that case, the idea of having your heart removed and another one put in is actually kind of horrific. That's a little unsettling if you've never seen or heard of a heart transplant being a real thing. How about werewolves in the Bible? Daniel 4:29. At the end of 12 months, he, that is Nebuchadnezzar, walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. The king spake and said, Isn't this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by my mighty power and for the honor of their majesty? While the word was still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, your kingdom has left you. They will drive you from humanity, and your dwelling will be with the beasts of the field. They will make you to eat grass like oxen, and 7 times will pass over you until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of humanity and gives it to whoever he desires. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from humanity. He ate grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagles, and his nails like birds' claws. Oh, that is just this disgusting, almost werewolf-type imagery, and it's right there in the Bible, in a very popular passage as well. But we just don't tend to think of this as what it really is. We've heard it so many times, we become desensitized to what the Bible's actually trying to say and how horrific this image would be. Imagine being the prophet who had to see this foretold. If you think your nightmares are vivid and lifelike, just imagine the impact of having to see stuff like this. What about Godzilla-like creatures coming from the sea? This is also in Daniel chapter 7, verse 2. Daniel spoke and said, "I saw in my vision by night, behold, 4 winds of the heavens strove, they fought over the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, each one different from the other. The first one was like a lion, but it had eagle's wings. And I looked, the wings were pulled off of it, and it was lifted from the earth and made to stand on its 2 feet like a human, and a human's heart was given to it." There we go with a Frankenstein type of creature again. And behold, another beast, a second, that looked like a bear. It raised itself up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it between the teeth of it. I guarantee you that those were not bloodless. That sounds pretty violent. And they said thus to it, "Arise, devour much flesh." After this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings like a fowl. The beast also had 4 heads. Whew, that's freaky. And dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful, terrible, extremely strong, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces, and it stomped on the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the 10 horns, and look, there came up from them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns pulled up from the roots of its head. And behold, in this horn were eyes like human eyes, and a mouth that spoke great and horrible things. Oh my word, people, that is freaky. That is your inspired Bible. This is why we're saying that horror is actually a very biblical genre. God is using it all throughout these stories. Oh yeah, by the way, in this story with that 4th beast and the horn that came up in its head with eyes in it, yeah, that creature is burned in the story. Imagine the smell and look of that. Verse 11 says, "I have beheld because the voice of the great words which the horn spake, even until the beast was slain, its body was destroyed and given to burning flame." Daniel also mentions supernatural battles that happen between the forces of good and evil behind humanity. In an extremely strange passage in Daniel 10, verse 13, he says, "The prince of the kingdom of Persia," now that's not talking about a human prince, he's talking about a supernatural being there. "The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me." This is an angel speaking. So, an angel is saying, I got in a fight for 3 weeks, 21 days, with this supernatural ruler over Persia. But then Michael, a chief prince, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings of Persia. Whatever that is talking about, we don't know for sure. It's freaky and weird, but it's there in the Bible, and that's supernatural fights between good and evil. There are genetically mutated monsters that torture people for pleasure, keeping them alive just for the sadistic joy of seeing them in pain. This is out of Revelation 9. "The 5th angel blew the trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from heaven to the earth, and the key of the shaft of the abyss was given to him. He opened the shaft of the abyss. Smoke went up from the shaft like smoke of a great furnace. The sun and the air were darkened by the smoke from the shaft. And out of the smoke, locusts came to the earth. Power was given to them to be like scorpions over the earth. And it was told that they should not damage the grass of the earth, or any green plant or tree, except those people who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And it was granted to them that they should not kill them, but that they would be tormented 5 months, and their torment is like the torment of a scorpion when it stings a person. In those days people will seek death, but never find it. They will long to die, and death will flee from them." That is horrifying. and it's right here in the Bible. The story continues with these scorpion bugs that are flying over the earth and torturing humanity. The appearance of these locusts, it was like horses prepared for battle, and on their heads were something like crowns, similar in appearance to gold. Their faces were men's faces. Oh my word. They had hair like women and their teeth like lions. They had breastplates made of iron and wings like many horse-drawn chariots running into battle. Their tails looked like scorpions and stings that could injure people for 5 months. Holy crap. If that isn't a horror movie waiting to be made, I don't know what is. And this just keeps going on. We could spend hours on this. Fire-breathing griffins, chapter 9 of Revelation. I saw the horse in the vision, those seated on them who had fiery red and hyacinth-colored and sulphurous yellow breastplates. The heads of the horses were like lions, and out of their mouths came fire and smoke and sulphur. So you have flying horses with lion heads that breathe fire. Yikes. Chapter 13 has 7-headed hydra with horns and hypnotic power over the entirety of the earth. I saw coming out of the sea a beast that had 10 horns and 7 heads. And on its horn, 10 royal headbands. On its head was a blasphemous name, and the beast that I saw looked like a leopard, but its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion, and the dragon gave it power over its throne and great authority. One of its head appeared as though slaughtered to death, and its fatal wound had been healed, and the whole earth was astonished and followed after the beast, and they worshipped the dragon, because he had given authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like this beast? Who is able to make war with him?" And a mouth was given to it to speak things that were great and terrible blasphemies. Authority to act was given to him for 42 months. And he opened his mouth to blaspheme God, to blaspheme his name and his dwelling, those who live in heaven. And it was given him to make war with the saints and to conquer them. You get that? There is a time when it looks like evil wins in some of these Bible stories. Now, I realize in the end, God wins. But there does come a time, and even in life, where it seems like evil is going to win. And in a good story, that is going to show up. This kind of creature sounds like something right out of like Game of Thrones, or Stranger Things, or Lord of the Rings, or some kind of fantasy series, Dungeons and Dragons sort of thing almost. This is all throughout the Bible, these sorts of imagery. Very vivid, very graphic. How about zombies, or skeletons? We have that show up in Ezekiel 37. Now, this is a relatively popular story. In fact, there was the old song, Ezekiel cried them dry bones. So, if you've heard this before, try to consider what this would actually look like to the prophet Ezekiel, who is seeing this for the first time. And imagine how horrifying this would actually be. The hand of Yahweh was upon me, and he brought me by the Spirit, and he let me rest in the midst of the valley, and it was full of bones. And he led me all around over them. And look, very many were on the surface of the valley, just covered in dry bones. And he said, "Son of man, can these bones live?" And I said, "Oh, Lord Yahweh, you know." And he said to me, "Prophesy to those bones, and say to them, say to the dry bones, hear the word of Yahweh. Thus says the Lord Yahweh to these bones, look, I am bringing into you breath, and you will live. I will lay on you sinews, and I will let flesh come upon you. I will cover you with skin, and I will put breath into you, and you will live and know that I am Yahweh." And I prophesied just like I'd been commanded. There was a sound at my prophesying, and look, a rattling, and they came together, the bones, bone upon bone. And I looked, and sinews were on them, flesh went up, and skin covered over them, but breath wasn't in them. This is a zombie army that came back to life. And he said, "Prophesy to the breath, and say to it, thus says Yahweh from the four winds, come, O spirit and breath, on these dead ones, so that they may live." And I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, animating these bones, and they became alive and stood on their feet, a very large army. God's message to them continues, "Look, I am opening your graves. I will bring you up from the graves, my people, and I will bring you into the land of Israel. And you will know that I am Yahweh when I open your graves, that you will live, and I will cause you to rest on your soil, and you will know that I, Yahweh, have spoken, and I will act." Wow. I know that's a hopeful message given to Israel that once again they will be able to live again in the land. But what a strangely gory, grotesque image to show the prophet to get this across. I mean, just imagine a bunch of bones laying out on the dry desert sun, and then all of a sudden they start to magnetically form back together into a human body. And then muscle appears on that, and nerve endings, and skin. It's just disgusting even to think about. But it's the image that God chose for the people here. And the Bible is full of that sort of thing. It's also full of human violence and gore. I realize some of this that we're getting into here is going to be a little dark, but it is still in the Bible, so we have to admit that it's there, and we can't just ignore it. There's cannibalism all throughout the Bible. Micah 3 is particularly potent illustration of this. I said, "Hear, I pray you, O heads of Jacob, and you princes of the house of Israel. Is it not for you to know judgment, who hate the good and love the evil, who pluck off their skins from them and their flesh from their bones? You eat the flesh of my people and flay their skin from them. You break their bones, chop them in pieces, like you're going to throw them in a pot for stew and flesh in the cauldron." Whoa! Ezekiel 36. Thus says Yahweh God, because they said to you, the land devoureth up humanity and has bereaved the nations, therefore you will devour humanity no more, you will not bereave the nations any longer. Psalm 27:2, when the wicked, even mine enemies and my foes, came upon me to eat up my flesh, they stumbled and fell. Proverbs 30:14, there is a generation whose teeth are like swords, their jaw like knives, to devour the poor from off the earth and the needy from among men. Jeremiah 19:9, I will cause them to eat the flesh of their sons and their daughters, and they will eat every one the flesh of his friend in the siege and straitness, wherewith their enemies and those who seek their life will straiten them. Zechariah 11:9, then I said, I will not feed you that dies. Let it die, that it be cut off, let it be cut off, and let the rest eat every one the flesh of another. Oh, that is beyond Hannibal the Cannibal right there. That is some crazy stuff. There's even depictions of child abuse in the Bible. Ezekiel chapter 16 tells a very gruesome tale, where the word of Yahweh comes to the prophet and says, Son of man, make known to Jerusalem how detestable it is, and say, Thus says the Lord Yahweh to Jerusalem, your origin and your birth were from the land of the Canaanites. Your father was an Amorite, your mother was a Hittite. As for your birth, on the day you were born, your umbilical cord was not cut. You were not thoroughly washed clean with water. You were not thoroughly rubbed with salt. You were not carefully wrapped in strips of cloth. No eye took pity on you to do one of these things to show compassion for you. You were thrown into the open field in their despising you on the day you were born. I passed by and saw you kicking about in your own blood. Whoa, that is just horrifying to imagine. And yet that is the divinely chosen mode for getting across the message that God wanted to share. There is all kinds of explicit sex throughout the Bible as well. This is Ezekiel in chapter 23. God is speaking to Israel and Judah, specifically to Judah at this point. Israel has already fallen to Assyria. And he's using the names Oholah and Oholibah, very similar, Oholah and Oholibah, to refer to Israel and Judah. And he says, And Oholah prostituted herself while she was still my wife, and she lusted for her lovers, for Assyria who was nearby, clothed in blue cloth, governors and prefects, handsome young men, and all of them horsemen. And she bestowed her fornication on them, on the choicest of the Assyrians. All of them, with every one of them she lusted. With all of their idols she defiled herself. Her whorings from the time of Egypt she did not abandon, for they slept with her in her childhood. There we go again, with child abuse in the Bible. And they caressed the bosoms of her virginity. They poured out their fornication upon her. Yes, that means exactly what you think it does. Therefore, I gave her into the hand of her lovers, into the hand of the Assyrians, after whom she lusted. They uncovered her nakedness. This is rape being described here. They took her sons and her daughters, and then they killed her with the sword. And though Oholibah saw her sister in this way, yet she continued to lust and behave more corruptly than her. Her whoring was more than the prostitution of her sister. She lusted after the Assyrians, governors and prefects, warriors clothed in perfection, expert horsemen, all of them handsome young men. She was defiled. They both took the same path. She increased her prostitution. She saw men carved on the wall, images of Chaldeans carved in red, belted with a belt at their waist with turbans on their heads, all of them giving the appearance of adjutants. The image of the Babylonians, Chaldea was the land of their birth. She lusted for them when her eyes saw them. I got a little bit of a Genesis 3 thing going on there. And she sent messengers to them at Chaldea. And so the Babylonians came to her for the bed of lovemaking, and they defiled her with their fornication. She was defiled by them and turned from them. And she revealed her whorings. She revealed her nakedness, public nudity, and I turned from her just as I turned from her sister. Yet she increased in her prostitution, recalling the days of her childhood when she was prostituted in Egypt. She lusted after her male lovers whose genitalia were the genitalia of male donkeys and their seminal emission the seminal emission of horses. And you longed about the obscene conduct of your youth when your bosom was caressed by Egypt, fondling your young breasts. Okay, so if this isn't enough for you, God, in divine inspiration, spoke a message to the prophet Ezekiel to say, tell an entire nation, so Ezekiel has to share this message several times, tell an entire nation that you were unfaithful to me, so much so that it would be like a married woman going out and calling for sex to every guy that she saw, and then, and I apologize, but this is just the Bible right here, she specifically targets guys with large genitalia and whose semen is like a horse's emission. Oh, and it gets worse, because as the verses continue on, God talks about the judgment he is going to send against this adulterous prostitute of a wife that he is calling Judah. He says, I'm going to send your enemies to you, and they will strip you of your clothes. So God is saying, the punishment for you is going to be rape. Now that should make you very uncomfortable. And I will put an end to your obscene conduct coming from you and the fornication you gave in the land of Egypt. You will not lift your eyes to them. You will not remember Egypt again. Look, I am giving you into the hands of those you hated. They will deal with you in hatred, that is very sexual, and they will take all of your acquisitions, leave you naked and in barrenness, the naked of the things accomplished against you since you prostituted yourself against the nations. On account of that, you defiled yourself by their idols. That is disgusting, and it should be disturbing to you that God used that imagery. That is the kind of thing that wouldn't even be allowed in an R-rated movie. Okay, that would be unrated. Very, very hard unrated. And as if that wasn't enough, another part of Ezekiel is very explicit about sex toys. Ezekiel 16:16. You took from your clothes and you decked the high places with all kinds of colors. You played the harlot upon them, like things that shall not come, neither shall it be so. You took your fair jewels of my gold and my silver, which I had given to you, and you made yourself images of men and committed whoredom with them. Now, let me put that in modern English for you. The rings, the wedding ring, the 10th anniversary ring, the necklace, all the stuff that the lover gave to this woman. She melts down and turns into idols that she uses as metal dildos. Yes, that's in the Bible. That is exactly what that verse is talking about. And that is extremely gratuitous. There is zero reason for the Bible to be that explicit in this passage. There are so many other passages in Scripture that talk about going after other gods as being adultery, but leave it at that. They don't go into any further detail. Ezekiel was apparently the horniest person of the entire Bible. He's the type of guy that would say, do you want the nature metaphor or the sexual metaphor? And then give you two sexual metaphors. Like, this guy, under divine inspiration, remember, was extremely obsessed with sex and used it in just about every one of the metaphors throughout his book. That is extremely gratuitous and unnecessary for the message he was trying to tell, but it's in there anyway and got included in the Bible. So definitely something that you're not going to hear in church this week, but it's there. There is explicit prostitution crossed with vampirism. Revelation 17 said, there came one of the 7 angels who had 7 vials, and he talked with me and said, come here, I am going to show you the judgment of the great prostitute that sits upon many waters. Now, I draw your attention to this because God, through this angel, is showing a prostitute to John, specifically drawing attention to her. So where a lot of Christians would say we shouldn't even be depicting anything remotely inappropriate, God says, oh yeah, come here, I want to show you a prostitute. Now, if you know she's a prostitute just by looking at her, I'm guessing that's not her Sunday best she's wearing. So just something to think about here, that apparently God is okay with saying, let me show you. Remember, this is a vision, okay? This is not just words John is putting on paper. This is a vision. He is seeing this. He is about to see this prostitute and what happens to her. And apparently God is okay with that because he's the one who is having the angel do this. Verse 2, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. He carried me away in the spirit in the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit on a scarlet beast, full of the names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and she was arrayed in purple and scarlet, decked with gold and precious stones. She had a golden cup in her hand, full of the abominations and filthiness of her fornication, and on her name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abomination of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, vampire, and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, and when I saw her, I wondered greatly. Oh yeah, and as this continues, verse 16 has her stripped naked, cannibalized while still alive, and then burned while still alive. All stuff that John had to see under divine order. Interesting. Remember that iconic scene from The Shining where the elevator comes down and blood flows through the entire hallway? Yeah, that happens a lot in the Bible too. A great example of this is Revelation 14:20. And the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out from the winepress, even to the horse's bridle, by the space of 1,600 furlongs. Just this massive ocean wave of blood sweeping over the entire land where you're swimming in it. There are apocalyptic meteor showers in the Bible. Daniel 8:10, it waxed great, even to the host of heaven. It cast down some of the host and the stars to the ground and stamped on them. There are gross pandemics. Chapter 16 of Revelation, the first angel went out and poured his bowl on the earth. There was an evil and painful sore on the people who had the mark of the beast and who worshipped his image. And the second one poured out his bowl on the sea. It became like blood, like that of a dead person, and every living thing in the sea died. The Bible includes stories of crushing bodies and trampling on faces, grinding them into the earth. Isaiah 3, what do you mean that you have beat my people to pieces and grind the faces of the poor, says Yahweh God of hosts. In a scene right out of Macbeth, Isaiah 1:15 has bloody, murderous hands. When you spread forth your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. When you make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. Revelation 11 talks about rotting corpses in the street that aren't allowed to be buried, and people celebrate over them. The Bible is just full of all kinds of horrific imagery used to make a point. Gadawa reminds us that this is not just the human authors. He says it is God himself who rolled the camera and directed the action. God himself enjoys the horror genre. That is God-breathed inerrancy. The author of this faith didn't grow out of it after the Old Testament. In fact, he may have received an even harsher movie rating in his later production, the New Testament. The Book of Revelation is an epic horror fantasy sequel to the Book of Daniel, complete with science fiction special effects and spectacles of horror darker than any movie you could see today. And I might add, it gives glory to God in the highest. The apocalyptic genre that was used by the prophets and apostles of God relied heavily on images of horror to solicit holy fear of sin and its consequences in their audience and point them to God. Horror and thriller movies, and by extension other forms of horror storytelling or image making, can accomplish the same prophetic redemptive task in several ways. First, horror can be redemptive by reinforcing the doctrine of man's sinful nature. Gothic storytelling prides itself on exploiting man's fear of his dark side through vampires, werewolves, and other half-man, half-monster creatures. These freaks of nature or supernature personify the cultured, educated man by day and the unbridled beast by night. They represent the gospel truth that our evil nature avoids the light lest its deeds be exposed, and that true evil is done by otherwise normal people who suppress the truth about themselves in unrighteousness. We are all Jekylls and Hyde. In Ezekiel 16 and 23, God describes Israel's spiritual condition figuratively as a harlot spreading her legs to every Egyptian, Assyrian, and Chaldean who passes by, as well as to donkeys, which is bestiality, and to idols as sexual devices. The book of Judges depicts the horrors of a society where everyone does that which is right in his own eyes, such as gang rapes, dismemberment, burning victims alive, cutting off thumbs, and disemboweling, among other monstrous atrocities that illustrate their need for repentance. This is exactly the tactic God uses with his prophets under both Old and New Covenants. God uses horrific images explicitly in order to put up a mirror to cultures of social injustice and spiritual defilement. God used gang rape of a harlot and dismemberment of her body as a metaphor for Israel's spiritual apostasy, and the resurrection of skeletal remains as a symbol for the restoration of his people with the covenant. Our holy, loving, kind, and good God used all these different horror images to visually depict cultural decay and social injustice. The portrayal of good and evil, as well as their consequences, are two sides of God's one honorable, pure, lovely, excellent, and praiseworthy truth. According to the Bible, pointing out wrong is part of dwelling on what is right. Exposing lies is part of dwelling on the truth. Revealing cowardice is part of dwelling on the honorable. And uncovering corruption is part of dwelling on the pure. Horror is a strongly biblical medium for God's social commentary. End of quote. Okay, I know we covered a lot today that was kind of on the darker side. I mean, the entire episode was talking about horror and the Bible, and that's not usually the topics that you hear about in an average church sermon, so I realized that this may have been a very different look at the Bible than you have ever had before. And it may even seem discouraging or just very dark with the subject matter. But I want to remind you that speaking of these things, talking about them, drawing attention to the fact that they are in our scriptures, is not a bad thing. These are not stories that should be hidden. If we claim to follow the Bible in its entirety, we can't just pick and choose the stuff that makes it into a children's Bible. We have to be honest about the entire narrative, both the positive stories and the negative ones. Both the nice, happy, hallmarky depictions of life and the grotesque, hard R horror movie depictions. Let's remember that within the Bible there are both stories of horror and of hope, of gore and of redemption. The Bible, just like horror movies and Halloween, reminds us that we can confront our fears, both real and imagined, and come out stronger on the other side of them. So, in the spirit of the season, I want to remind you not to forget faith. Faith and courage can help us face even the greatest monsters that show up in our real lives. So as we get toward the end of the month here, I want to encourage you and give you permission to lean into the spirit of the season a little bit and be reminded of the victory over death and the ways of death that God provides to us. Next week, I want to tease this out just a little bit more. Next week is going to be a very unique episode. We're going to do a dramatization of certain Bible stories from a horror perspective and drawing on popular horror movie tropes from the genre. So it's going to be a very unique way to look at perhaps some familiar and unfamiliar stories from within the pages of the Bible. Until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.